Dead Sleep Triple Terror Feature, Volume 1. I got a job as a night guard for a flower shop, and I was given a set of strange rules to follow. My parents had both died in a car crash, and I was at my lowest in a small town in West Virginia. I was 17, almost 18, living with my grandma and struggling to find some good work. While walking down the street to get a newspaper to check for job offers, I walked past a small flower shop named Rosemary's Roses that had a piece of paper with handwritten cursive writing that stated, "Night guard needed for my flower shop. Thieves keep stealing rare flowers. Requirements, at least 18 and tall muscular figure. Ask inside. $125 per night." I looked at that number over and over and thought, $125? Count me in. And I went inside. There was a frail-looking old lady at the counter who I'm guessing was Rosemary, and she was reading a botany magazine. She greeted me with, "Hello, darling. Would you like to make a purchase or just browse?" I instantly responded with, I want to apply as a night guard." She looked at my form, and her face lit up as she said, "Well, all right. No time for interviews. There's really not too much to this job. Your shift starts today. Take this key and come at 12 p.m. Your shift ends at 7:30. I was surprised with how desperate she was. Maybe it was my form. I'm 6'3" and halfway to being shredded, or the problem was as bad as she was making it seem. As the clock hit 11:30 p.m., I arrived and unlocked the door to the shop. The lights were out, and I could barely see, so I stumbled over to the light switch and turned it on. On the small table where Rosemary would sit, next to a giant Venus flytrap, was another piece of paper with the same cursive on it. There stood, "Hello, night guard. Welcome to the job. You may sit in my chair and browse through my gardening magazines or use your mobile device, if you have one, during your free time. There are several rules to this job, so please read them thoroughly. If you are confused by the plant type mentioned, refer to the signs next to them. Rule number 1, conduct a patrol every hour. Make sure everything is in its place and there's no one snooping around. Rule number 2, if you're walking in the back next to the rare flower section and the climbing rose starts growing rapidly and is squirming, grab a pair of the provided wire cutters and cut off at least 5 inches of it before sealing the cut part with plant glue. Do this quickly, or it might wrap itself around you. Rule number 3, if the giant Venus flytrap on your desk starts screaming while you are in the time between your patrols, hide under your desk. You will see a figure resembling a man covered in leaves walking around. Grab the provided hydrochloric acid spray bottle and spray it 5 to 6 times. It will scream and it will try to hit you, but it will die before it can. Rule number 4. At around 1:30, if you notice an abundance of morphed-looking bees around while you're on your patrol or at the desk, grab the beekeeper suit in the drawer of the desk and the same hydrochloric acid and locate the hive. It will usually be dark brown and be in the back room of the shop, near the hibiscus. Spray it 3 times and then get out of there, fast. Rule number 5, if a, quote, customer enters, then respond to its request. It will ask for either a Blythus comparatus, red pine, or black vine. None of these exist. If it asks for the Blythus comparatus, tell it that it's sold out. If it asks for the red pine, oblige and grab a red rose from the back and give it to it. If it asks for the black vine, look in the drawer and find the small pistol which is in there. Threaten him to leave, and if it doesn't, use the pistol to neutralize it. Remember to make sure it starts evaporating before returning to your duties. Rule number 6, if on your patrol you start hearing the flowers talking to you, locate the exact flower and pull it out with the root and dispose of it in the waste bin. Rule number 7. There might be flower pots or flowers moving around during your patrols, so make sure to put them back or replant them. Rule number 8. If an actual thief enters, make him get on the floor or with a pistol and call the police with the landline if you don't have a cell phone. If he threatens you or doesn't listen, do what you think is right. I laughed and thought the lady had a problem or something, and then I went out on the requested patrol. I was walking near the rare flower section when I saw some movement in the corner of my eye. The climbing rose. It was moving. I was fascinated and looked at it for a good while before it started coming to me. I continued marveling at it when it latched onto my arm and started tightening. Its thorns dug into my skin, and I quickly reached for the wire cutters, which were almost out of reach, and I cut that stuff off. It quickly fell limp, and I sealed its amputated part with the plant glue. After the encounter, I studied my wounds and found the holes in my arm weren't that bad, so I didn't try to patch them up. I quickly realized that the lady wasn't kidding about the rules. I was 30 minutes into my free time when I heard some relatively quiet screeching. I looked around when I noticed it was coming from the giant Venus flytrap. I looked through the rules and quickly went, "Oh shit," before hiding. A tall figure, which looked like a man with a ghillie suit on, strolled through the area with a limp. I examined its form before it went out of my sight. I grabbed the acid bottle and ran out of the space under the desk. It looked at me and screeched, but then I sprayed it. It started sprinting toward me, and right when it was about to hit me, it evaporated, and I was caked with its dust. At 1:20 a.m., 10 minutes after an uneventful patrol, I heard a slight buzzing that sounded distant. At 1:25 a.m., I saw a mentioned bee but thought nothing of it. At 1:30 a.m., I noticed the sheer volume of bees that had collected. I kind of recoiled and donned the beekeeper suit and the spray bottle. As I walked over to the back room, I could barely hear. The buzzing was too loud, and my vision was almost non-existent with the number of bees. I reached the nest, and it was a huge thing that was as big as an 8-year-old. I panicked and sprayed it like 10 times in 2 seconds with a trigger finger which I never knew I had, and I ran. I heard a loud pop behind me and a horde of bees coming toward me, and then it fell silent. The bees were all gone, and so was the nest. At around 2 a.m., before a patrol, the mentioned, quote, customer arrived. It was kind of average looking, but with the dark, hollowed eyes of a sleep-deprived college student. It was wearing formal attire and had asked for a red pine, thankfully. I gave it a bright red rose, and it thanked me before leaving. During the next patrol, I heard a distinct whispering. I stopped and listened, and realized someone or something was trying to talk to me. "Hey, come here, man," I heard from the corner. I walked over before realizing there was no one and nothing was there except a red tulip. Then I recalled Rule 6. I tried to grab the tulip next to the root, but then it did something that made me stop in my tracks. I could hear my parents. They begged me not to pull out the tulip. I sort of obliged before pushing myself to rip it out. You can bet that I dunked that stupid tulip into the trash. During the next 2 to 3 patrols, some object movement happened, but nothing serious. I did notice that the same guy walked by the store like 6 times and peering into it. I pulled out the pistol, which was a small Walther PPK, just in case, but I never used it. My situation was really bad then, and living with my grandma didn't make anything better. I contemplated continuing that strange job for the pay. Dead Sleep Triple Terror Feature, Story 2. We broke into a museum. I can't unsee what we found. Before all of this, I was your normal college frat guy. I won't beat around the bush about it. I was an asshole, as were all my friends. That's why, when walking back to our hotel room the last spring break party we'd ever attend, we decided to break into a museum. It was our idea of a harmless prank. It wasn't some big science museum like the Smithsonian, you understand. This was a small 2-story building housing various artifacts of importance to the locals. It was a time capsule containing all the memories of when this beachside settlement was still known for the prize sea bass fishermen caught, as opposed to the drunk partygoers. Our selfish plan, which I am not at all proud of, was to go in, strip the wax figures in the exhibits down to the nude, then pose them in, compromising positions. We could barely contain our drunk giggling as we searched in the dark for an entranceway at the rear of the building. There were 4 of us, me, Larry, Ethan, and Jeff. It didn't take long for one of us to jimmy the rustled lock on the back door and slip inside. At the time, I was glad the museum wasn't rigged with an alarm system. These days, I wish it had been. If it had, the 4 of us would have been apprehended before we started poking around the unlit exhibits. It was Jeff who found the storage room. Behind an imposing diorama of some local men fighting off a large sea creature out on the ocean was a trap door. It was made of the same sun-bleached beechwood the rest of the ground floor was decked with. The dozen or so hinges on one side were small, almost hidden. The thin seam that ran between the hatch and the rest of the flooring boarded on invisible. If Jeff hadn't tripped on an errant harpoon Ethan had displaced, he might have never noticed it. As it was, the rest of us stopped when we heard his voice drift up from the floor. "Guys, there's a basement." Of course, we went down there. It took all of us 5 minutes to repurpose a 19th century fisherman's knife into a trapdoor unwedging tool. The 4-foot by 4-foot square of beechwood didn't have a handle that we could find, nor any keyhole to suggest we needed to search for keys. It swung open without creak or protest, almost like the forgotten and often ignored museum wanted us 4 loud, brash, obnoxious spring breakers to venture into its depths. Cell phone flashlights flared into life one by one as we each reached the cool air at the foot of the ladder. The windows kept the dusty ground floor bathed in moonlight, but the space below was pitch black. It was a landing of sorts, a square concrete space with no light fixtures that we could see. A quick scan with the 4 flashlight beams showed us the room's only feature almost instantly: a door on the opposite wall. The bold black font on the yellow plastic sign meant we didn't have to guess the room beyond's purpose. Storage, management only. We were 4 drunk frat boys on spring break. 4 drunk frat boys who could already be booked for a string of offenses from vandalism to breaking and entering to being drunk and disorderly. What else were we supposed to see the words management only as other than a challenge? Jeff had discovered the hatch to the basement, but it was I who opened the door marked management only. Larry, Ethan, and Jeff were on the tiptoes over my shoulder, whooping and hollering excitedly as I delivered kick after kick to the locked door handle. The inebriated ruckus stopped the moment the wood around the lock splintered. The door swung inwards. A bony face leered down at me. I screamed, stumbling backward and falling flat on my ass. The other 3 were howling with laughter. I looked up, anger replacing the fear in my throat. The pallid teeth and empty sockets belonged to a human skeleton, one of the kind scholars in the olden days used to study anatomy. The grinning skull seemed to laugh along with my friends from its glass case as I pulled myself to my feet, swearing under my breath. "Very funny," I snapped as we walked past the silently guffawing skeleton into the forbidden storage room. My friends continued chuckling as we made our way deeper into the inky blackness. However, The more we browsed the management-only artifacts with the beams from our cell phones, the quieter their intoxicated tittering became. The Museum of Local History on the floor above had been unsettling, but it was the kind of uncanny valley unsettling you get with badly crafted waxwork sculptures, bleak paintings of gray stormy seas, and painful-looking implements from history. The unsettling that comes from trespassing in the dark in a space never meant for viewing with the lights out. A normal kind of unsettling. The hidden exhibits revealed by the flashlights in our phones were a different kind of unsettling entirely. Larry noticed the first one. It was a painting. I'm no expert in art history, so I can't tell you from what era the artist belonged to. From the clothing of the foaming-mouthed figures depicted, it couldn't have been painted more recently than at the turn of the 19th century. We gazed at it together for a while, not saying much. The 8 men and women on the canvas had been painted so vividly they looked more as though they'd been captured by shutter and lens than by oil and brush. That's what made the expressions on their faces so frightening. Each pair of eyes were bulging, protruding so far that veins and muscles were clearly visible where eyelids should have been. Their snarling lips peeled back tightly so that every crack and frothing crevice in the gums around their yellow teeth could be seen. 8 snarling, ravenous faces dancing around a pile of flaming logs at the base of a wooden pole. A pole that had a crying child tied to the top, dangling mere feet from the flames. That wasn't what made the lump catch in my throat, though. Not initially, at least. No. What first made me start to consider the possibility I was somewhere very wrong was the building the mad dancers were making their sacrifice in front of. It was our hotel. Our many times since refurbished but still very much rustic and true to the town's roots hotel. The painting didn't have a title or a frame. It hung on a rusted nail and dirty string from the cinder-blocked walls. After a few minutes, one of us shuddered and suggested we move on. Unfortunately, the rest of the exhibits only gave the growing tightness in my chest further cause to take hold. The lump in my throat grew heavier with each illuminated exhibit. The spaces between breaths shorter and shorter with every new oddity the museum management kept hidden down here, away from minds too weak to comprehend them. They were taxidermied creatures none amongst us recognized. Stuffed things with forms completely unfamiliar. A menagerie of twisted beings with no tangible adherence to the laws of nature or biology. There was a school of 6 dried fish, each sporting 3 pairs of inch-long human arms, hung on wire from a thin pipe scaffold. There was what I could only describe as an orangutan with matted dark fur, no head, and a large mouth where its belly should be, locked forever in a duel with a rhino-sized frog on a large wooden plinth. Most shocking of all was the large, dried-out husk of a bus-sized maggot with the face of a colossal human baby, hanging from the ceiling by thick cables screwed into somewhere unseen on its back. We found dioramas and paintings of horrific acts and incidents, the details so clear they could only have been recreated from a memory. There were shelves of dusty books, volumes bound in I don't know what, books with titles like Ha Ha Ha, The Children Are Bleeding, A Housewife's Tale, and The Sanctity of Silence. Scattered amongst the paintings, shelves, and grotesque anatomies were glass cases containing tools and implements whose design seems far too intricate and advanced to carry the level of rust and corrosion they did. Despite the fresh wave of dread that came with every new monstrosity, we pressed on, trying and failing to convince both each other and ourselves that none of them were real. It's just leftover stuff from some stupid art project. Look, you can see on that one, it's obviously made of rubber, right? Whoever made this stuff was a real twisted guy, probably some sick kind of basement dweller. These comments and many more did nothing to stem the rising panic in what forced, nervous laughs remained. We'd been stupidly traumatizing ourselves in the crushing darkness for a half hour before I found it. A mask laying alone on a plinth a full 6 feet away from any other nightmarish exhibits. I spotted it first. I wish that hadn't been the case. If one of the others had been the first to unearth it in the dark with the glare of their phone light, maybe they would have been the idiot that put it on. It was completely blank save for a half dozen or so angular symbols carved thumb deep into its surface. There were no eye, nose, or mouth holes, no gaps with which the wearer could see or breathe. It was made of metal I didn't recognize, a dark and bluish mottled substance that reflected the light from my phone back at me as a heady mix of purples, oranges, and greens, almost like an oil slick. Its strangest qualities are more difficult to put into words. I can't quite phrase it right, but it knew I was looking at it. It was happy. It had wanted to be found, and in a way I can't explain, it let me know that very clearly. It called to me, communicating with subconscious suggestions that this was the one time where you should touch the exhibit. I was already holding the thing in my hands before Larry or Jeff or Ethan yelled something in my direction through the haze. Even though the air this far into the mausoleum of unutterable things was freezing, the mask was warm to the touch. Its pearlescent metal surface soothed my fingertips, inviting me to feel its bliss-inducing heat on my face. I just about registered a hand on my shoulder when the mask's velvet interior sucked onto my waiting, smiling features. Instantly, I knew I'd fucked up. When my eyes opened, I wasn't in the storage room. I wasn't anywhere. I was floating in a void, surrounded by nothing but endless blackness. No, not floating, falling. There was no air, but the emptiness rippled and skimmed my face as I plummeted. All around me was pitch black. Yet, as I strained, I realized to my growing horror that there were shades and tones to that absolute nothingness, despite the fact that this is utterly impossible. Streaks of the dark shadows that concealed monsters under children's beds, patches of moonless nights with which unspeakable things prowl, gulfs of the unknowable darkness that sits in the hearts of evil men. All of these shades of nothing had more danced and writhed around me when I tumbled, the friction that shouldn't exist in a vacuum ripping my skin raw. I'd been falling in a soundless scream for what felt like days when something slammed into my chest, knocking the wind out of me. Thump. The smell of sea air and fish brine pierced my nostrils. I could hear men grunting and shouting from every direction, roaring to be heard over the waves. There was a solid floor beneath me, wood that was wet and cold and smelled of dead things pulled from the depths. I'd been in the multi-tone darkness so long that it took me a few moments to register that my vision was returning. I stood, still screaming. My skin was still being whipped raw, but now the lashing came from freezing, rain-filled Atlantic winds. I was on a ship, the same fishing vessel from the diorama in front of the trapdoor in the museum. The fishermen were there too. They were staring at me, each stopping whatever important task they were doing to gawp at the sudden stranger in their midst. They didn't have time to gawp long. One of them yelled, pointing at something behind me. I turned around. The screams knocked from my horrified lungs by a fresh, inexpressible terror. The thick tentacle of the ocean monstrosity in the diorama crashed through the rigging above my head. Splinters and shards peppered the rain as I fell to my knees, wailing at the sight of those sewer plate-sized stickers lined with obviously human teeth. I was rooted, paralyzed with fear, as the squid-like appendage as thick as a train tunnel fell upon me. I closed my eyes, the smell and warmth of its flesh inches away from my face. Then I was falling again. The salty tang and raw of waves was replaced by the sting of rushing darkness. Thump. The wind was once more knocked from me. This time I could smell smoke, hear a child crying. I was in the painting Larry had found. The warmth of the fire licked my tear-stained face as I backed slowly away from the rabid dancers leaping towards me. They are whooping and hollering, screaming in a dated but recognizable dialect about my coming being a sign from the old gods. One manages to grab my arm and bite down, leaving a scar I could still feel but can't yet bring myself to look at. I turn to run, bumping into a sullen old man clutching a canvas, brushes, and some paints. Thump. I'm standing in a field. A crowd of indigenous-looking people stop skinning the headless orangutan thing they've killed to stand and point in my direction, reaching for their spears and axes. Before they can split my skull, there's a deafening ribbit. A frog the size of a rhinoceros leaps from the rushes. It lands on one of the natives. There's a loud crack on the wind as their spine breaks. Before either his kin or myself can react, I'm knocked to the ground by a sticky amphibious tongue with a tip the size of my face. I am wrenched from the ground, my fingernails filling the dirt as I scramble to pull myself away from the beast's awaiting maw. Thump. I am standing alone on a plain. Wild horses stampede around me, braying and snarling in panic. I turn around to see they're being chased by a living version of the baby-faced maggot husk from the museum. Spindly arms that must have rotted off, snatching up whole horses to stuff into its gaping, toothless mouth. Its glassy, lifeless eyes lock on mine, and somewhere in the back of my skull, I feel its sudden curiosity at the new thing before it. Thump. Knee-high prehistoric reptiles scamper at my feet. They stop building a waist-high obelisk and put down their miniature tools to observe me, conversing in a language of syllables and vowels impossible to replicate with the human tongue. Thump. Sulfur and ash clog my lungs. I can hear nothing but the roar of primordial tectonic fury. The sky is dark and red. Before my eyes are blinded by a layer of soot, I catch sights of a horizon of volcanoes and firestorms. Thump. I'm in space. A spiraling cloud of dust and debris sketches around me. From somewhere in the distance, the faint light of the infant star covers my choking form in a faint orange glow. Thump. I'm sitting in a chair. There is a glaring sun over me, although it is not my own. I wince from its brightness, straining to take in my surroundings. The chair is on a completely flat metal surface that glistens with the same pearlescent shimmer as the mask. This flat plane stretches around me in all directions until it reaches a large wall of the same material, thousands of miles in the distance and taller than any building the hands men could construct. The bindings and chair are like nothing I recognize. They are at once both organic seeming and flexible, yet apparently forged from the same rigid metallic substance as the ground. I don't have long to try and understand this contradiction, however. The booming voice from the stars beyond the alien sun made sure of that. Ah, good. We wondered when your kind would be ready. The power of it knocked what little breath remained from my lungs. I felt my eardrums burst. That's how I know I can't hide in the false comfort of convincing myself this never happened. I could never have imagined or conceived the owner of that atom-rattling voice, and even if I could, a voice in my head couldn't leave me permanently deaf. The end of the first sentence was enough to make sure I'd never hear anything again. The rumbling and buzzing in my every fiber let me know it was conversing as I looked up. Ears bleeding, and let out a scream I could no longer hear that I don't think stopped for several days. The alien sun wasn't a sun. It was a bulb, a planet-sized bulb hanging from wires as thick as Jupiter's red spot in diameter. The flat metal plane I was on wasn't an empty landscape. It was a petri dish. The real horror came when I worked out the true meaning of the shifting constellations in the sky above. The stars beyond the colossal bulb above the dish weren't stars at all. They were reflections in the trillions of eyes of the galaxy-sized being peering down at my impossible, tiny, insignificant form. Its scale was so vast that I could not make out many details beyond those eyes. An insurmountable number of pupils the size of stars blinked and drilled into me from the gaping, no longer emptiness of space above. Even craning my neck to look up directly, I could not see the full extent of its form. So colossal was the being that the twinkling reflections from the furthest of its eyes would have taken eons to reach the spot where I strained and fought against my bindings. The stellar gulfs between eyes were smoky and gaseous, yet I knew that beyond those plumes large enough to swallow the Milky Way, a vast cosmic anatomy lay hidden. At the great rim of the dish on which it studied me, its form spread into a nexus of thin tendrils. These magnitudinally impossible to measure swarms of ancient limbs ballooned and stretched outwards, forming thick, oily clouds that convulsed across the steel tundra. The rupturing buzz from the being beyond all reason didn't stop as one of these fogs sneaked towards me. Its tip was the size of a continent. I could feel the gravitational pull from it as it got closer, the sheer force threatening to rip me from this living metal chair. I was still screaming when my eyes rolled back into my skull, the experience finally too much for my mind to take without shutting off. Thump. I was in the basement of the museum. Larry, Jeff, and Ethan were standing above me. They were shaking me, saying something. I couldn't hear them. I couldn't hear anything but a shrill ringing that drowned out all other sounds. It didn't matter to me anyway. I ran both from the storage room and from them, but not before bending over to puke for a good 20 minutes. I was shaking, crying, could feel via the tearing in my throat that my screaming hadn't stopped. I never saw any of them after that night. I cut off all ties, didn't even message them to explain why. They could have got curious and tried on the mask themselves for all I know. I ran straight back to the hotel, covered in tears, grabbed my bags, and left. Sank everything I had into the first ticket back home. Not college home either. Home. I dropped out of school and moved back in with my parents. I can't look at photos of that time of my life, not without breaking down into a quivering mess. Even with heavy medication, the slightest reminder is enough for me to write off the rest of the day. Or at least it was. I've been getting better with the sign language, so I've gained back a little confidence. Enough to face writing down everything for the first time, to actually try to relive the memory and piece together what I saw. You probably wouldn't guess from the length, but this has taken me about 5 months to get down. I've had to stop multiple times, and even had to check back into a psych unit for a few days. It's been worth it though, looking back. It's out of my system now. That's the first step, right? Now I can go about the task of taking my therapist's advice and try to pretend it didn't happen. That's not her words for it, but they are mine. I know it happened. This wasn't a drunken memory distorted by a psychotic break. I remember all of it far too clearly. Plus, if it's a false memory, why did a mask-shaped package wrapped tightly in a crumpled canvas painting of madmen dancing around a pyre arrive on my doorstep this morning? Dead Sleep Triple Terror Feature, Story 3. I'm a bone jewelry merchant on Etsy. I should have known the deer skull wasn't mine to take. Many people are disturbed when they see roadkill, but I get a little bit excited. I'm not some sick freak that gets off on dead things. I just run a bone jewelry Etsy shop. I source my bones ethically. I don't have the guts to hurt living beings, so I usually find them in forests or on the side of the road. You have to treat the bones carefully. They once were alive, and I think they still hold their essence. My work honors the creatures. I hold small funerals for each animal I come across. I light some candles and incense, play some soft music and say a small prayer. I'm not religious, but it seems like a respectful thing to do. Ribs make lovely pendants, as do the vertebrae of smaller animals like badgers or rabbits. With more significant pieces like jaws, I like to create tiny holes to hang crystals held by wire, and, depending on the size, they can become wall decorations or necklaces. My most significant find has been an entire and intact rabbit skull, which I found alongside some damaged and cracked spine and rib bones. I like to decorate them with special paints and crystals, and sometimes I'll keep them plain by request. I have regulars who will ask me to keep certain bones for them in advance. For example, a user named Fia Rowan has been requesting a deer skull for around 5 months now. Unfortunately, Formby is known more for our red squirrels and natterjack toads. There are only a few sites within the UK where natterjack toads breed, a unique sales point. Whenever I come across one, my jewelry sells almost instantly. If you've ever seen what a toad's skull looks like, Google it. They're adorable. About 6 days ago, I went on my bi-weekly walk around local forests. Formby is wholly covered in forest and woods, so I cycle between the ones I visit. Naturally, the longer I leave visiting, the more bones I find, but I like to collect them as fresh as possible to treat them. As for the roadkill, friends and family members message me to alert me of any locations, which is a big help. I had about given up on a decent find when I spotted something between the brushes. I wasn't sure if it was litter or a bleached branch, but I found a complete deer head when I pushed back the branches. It was strange though. Not only was it completely intact, it wasn't a roe deer skull. It wasn't like any deer skull I had seen. Its head was a strange shape and was much sharper near the mouth nose, and the antlers looked mostly moose-like, while roe deers had thin, branch-like antlers that protrude from the back of their head rather than the side. I took it. Of course I took it. The day I refuse such a beauty is the day I check myself into a retirement home. I couldn't believe my find. I didn't bother looking for more bones. I rushed straight home. I took a few pictures of the pristine skull and did a Google reverse image search, and each matching picture led to a moose. Nothing about this skull seems similar to the fallow deer, which reside in the UK too. None of its features matched any of the 6 species of deer which belonged here. It was real. It wasn't like somebody's faux skull decoration. After cleaning it by soaking and then brushing it with a toothbrush and washing up liquid, I shamefully did the tongue test. If you didn't know, bones stick to your tongue. This has saved me a lot of time in the past. Where did you come from? I found myself asking it as if it would be able to move its jaw without muscle and share me its origins. So I brought it up with some online friends who enjoyed taxidermy until I got an answer from my Canadian friend Ashley. Ashley confirmed it was a moose, which technically is a species of deer. So that was one question answered, but I was still left wondering how it got here. I messaged Fia Ruan alongside a picture of the moose skull. Not many people considered moose and deer to be the same thing. If he didn't want the head, I was free to decorate it as I wished. Fia Ruan met me with negative energy. He told me to place it back as it wasn't like any deer he had seen. I reminded Fia Ruan he lived in Ireland and our species differed, but he seemed adamant that the skull was trouble. I pressed him for answers, unsure if he was just freaking out because he wanted a more traditional white-tailed deer skull, but he blocked me. I didn't dare ruin the beauty of this moose head. No paint would justify it, but I found a beauty in wrapping wire and crystals between the antlers. Part of me wanted to keep it, but I figured that I would place a listing for it, and if I were really against selling it, I would refuse it if anybody wanted to pay the $475 price tag for it. I gained multiple messages about the moose head. So many people curious how I came across it in the UK, most convinced it was a fake. Despite the beauty of it, I struggled to find somebody with an actual interest in it. A day after my find, a new account named 53.561852, -3.086349 messaged me. I almost ignored it as the preview of the message seemed like a template for a scam. However, in the end, I read through the text, and the user kindly requested that I return the skull where I found it or face the consequences, which sounded very cliche and cringe to me. The user then went into detail about protecting the forest, and I may have skipped over that part because of how ridiculous it was. That night I went to sleep. I had trouble at first, and it felt like I was just lying down for a really long time. But just as I was drifting off, the loud smash of glass caused my eyes to snap open. In the darkness of my room, illuminated by the soft glow of streetlights through the gap of my curtains, I saw a strange figure. The figure wasn't human. Whatever it was, it seemed malnourished and sickly. The figure moved around my room as if I was looking for something, and when it turned to the side, I saw that it had 4 legs rather than 2. I couldn't move, not that I wanted to anyway. I tried to search for a way to distinguish the being which occupied the space in front of me, and when I looked for a head, I found none. I accidentally let out a small gasp. The front of the being turned towards me, and I immediately closed my eyes. When I opened them again, inklings of daylight leaked into my room and no sign of the animal which visited last night. On my floor was a smashed glass bowl of miscellaneous bones. The bowl usually sat far from the edge of my dressing table, but had found its way to the floor. I wondered whether what I saw last night was real, or maybe we had a small earthquake. That day I had extreme luck with finding bones. I found a freshly dead red squirrel, so I packed it away to decompose it later. I'd also found what I thought to be a fox jaw. There was something strange about the atmosphere, though. The air had a strange feeling, one similar to just before it rains. The humidity was almost suffocating, despite the 4 degrees Celsius weather. I still felt odd, as if there was something else to add to the peculiar feeling. I was sure I wasn't being watched. I would have heard footfall if I were. These forests are full of debris on the floor. You couldn't sneak up to somebody, no matter how much you tried. I found the body of another squirrel. This time, its bones were somehow ground to dust by somebody, except for its head. Just as I bent down to examine the head, I noticed a white figure to the left of me. I had thought nothing of it at first, but it disappeared when I turned my head. This anomaly happened multiple times, and a majority of the bones I found were destroyed too. When I took the squirrel home, I did my usual process with dead animals, but blood came oozing out with white dust when I carefully cut open the hide. I thought it was infected, but I noticed it was the bones with a quick examination. "What the fuck?" I mumbled under my confused breath. Had everything just been trampled on? I was sure the squirrel had bones when I collected it, as it didn't flop around when I picked it up. I did a small ritual for the squirrel and then disposed of its body. I moved on to finish off some foot bone earrings, but those were grounded to dust too. Every bit of my bone had turned to dust except the still decorated moose skull. I received another message by 53.56182, -3.086349, but this time it was a short note telling me there's not much time. I ripped the wiring and crystals off the skull in a rage and threw them across the room. I intended on returning the skull the next day, as it was nearly nightfall and the forest I found it in was far. That night I fell asleep to a Netflix documentary. When I opened my eyes, I was in a dark forest. Despite the lack of light, I saw clearly. I tried to lift myself off the ground and found myself peering upon two fluffy paws. I was a rabbit. I had complete control of my head, but the rest of my body refused to listen to my mind. It felt like I was glued into place. I watched as a large bony creature crept around the area in front of me, its movements slow and graceful. I recognized the animal from the head. It was a moose, but instead of its normal fur, it was skeletal. Soon, I heard scuffling from the side of me. In the corner of my eyes, I saw a fox, crouched, ready to pounce. The moose watched on with its hollow eyes as I waited for my demise. I felt like I had sat for a century as the fox readied itself. Just before I could close my eyes, the fiend hopped on top and dug its sharp teeth into my back. It burnt and hurt like no pain I'd ever felt. The vixen shook my figure around aggressively as the moose watched on knowingly. When I woke up, I was sweaty and frightened. I was so traumatized by that dream I had to turn my light on. There was no way I could go back to sleep. It was 4:30 a.m., not long until daylight. I tried to shower to soothe myself, but as soon as the water hit my back, I recoiled from the pain. Finally, I was able to use 2 mirrors to get a good look at my back. And not only was there a bite mark over the 2 sides of my back, but it was painted with multiple fresh scratch marks, too delicate to have been done by human nails. I didn't bother finishing my shower. I rushed into a set of clothes, soaking the fabric with water and blood, and gathered the skull. Due to my speed, it took me less time than usual to get to the forest, and I threw my bike down at the entrance. I had difficulty finding the area last time due to the dim daylight that broke through the sky and tree line. I found myself stumbling over the rocks and branches which littered the forest floor. I heard trampling behind me. The sound I can only describe as hooves on soft dirt. I didn't have to look back to know what was following me. I picked up my speed and dodged upcoming trees. I used my free hand to push myself off to create more momentum and increase the distance between us. I could feel the being right behind me and hear the wind fly through the gaps in its bones. Its front hooves threatened to trample me. I got to the same brush and threw myself into it, and I used my body to protect the skull and quickly placed it, ignoring the pain which pulsed throughout my body. The forest was silent. Not even the coos of birds dared to echo in this space, but I knew I was safe. Now I know not to mess with things that don't belong.